Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council's Europe Center internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Ilva Tare and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. The European Parliament elections have just begun with 373 million eligible voters across the 27 nations, set to elect 720 members. I know you may feel lost, but this is nothing compared to the challenging issues that the new European Parliament needs to address in the next 5 years, while there are currently two wars in the world, one within the European continent. These elections will shape the next European Commission and its priorities amid predictions of significant gains for right-wing parties. The stakes are definitely high, with critical issues like the EU stance on Ukraine, China, the future of the single market, how to deal with refugees, artificial intelligence, the big tech, and green transition policies are up for debate. My guest today is Dave Keating, Brussels correspondent for France 24 and Europe Center non-resident senior fellow. Dave, welcome.
Hi, Ilva. Nice to meet with you.
I will jump straight to the first question, the key issues that are driving the European voters for these elections. What do you think they are? And are we expecting a low turnout? If yes, what factors might influence voters' participation?
Well, traditionally what tends to happen is that voters they don't have European issues on their mind when they go to vote in the European Parliament election. They're often thinking about national issues. It's been very hard to kind of drive that European demos and to get people kind of educated about what the European issues are. And a lot of voters tend to use these elections as protest votes. That's why you always see parties that are in power doing poorly and opposition parties doing well. Almost always, I should caveat. So what voters tend to have on their mind in this election, polls have shown, is migration is definitely a big focus, and that is giving some support to far-right and populist parties. The war in Ukraine is also on people's minds, but fairly low down. We're seeing a lot of anxiety about the economy, but also Europe's place in the world. Those who are thinking about European issues are thinking about certainly the prospect of Donald Trump coming into office, Russia always looming there, and also increasing competition with China. So those are some of the driving issues this year.
What is the usual turnout for the European elections?
So usually it's at around 50%, which is low by European standards, but I should say high by American standards. So you could kind of compare this to a U.S. midterm on a non-presidential year. And U.S. midterm turnouts are quite low, oftentimes below 40%. So this is still higher than a U.S. congressional election. However, European countries tend to have much higher voter turnouts than the United States. And so if you compare it to most national elections in Europe, 50% is fairly low.
And polls, I don't know, you have seen this and you have been reporting and talking about this. I guess the suggestion from the polls that the hard right parties will have significant gains. Do you agree with this? Do you see this mood with the people you talk?
So there's definitely going to be a rise, but I think it's important to explain what that rise is, what we're really talking about there. We're not actually talking about numbers, votes, or seats. Because that isn't going to be a surge. That's actually been a slow development over the past 20 years. Since the 2004 election, the share of the far-right seats in the parliament has gone steadily up on a pretty steady trajectory. It was below 5% in 2004, and now this year it looks like we're going to hit 20%. That's actually not that much higher than the 18% the far-right parties achieved in 2019. So when I keep seeing in the media this talk of a surge of far-right seats. It's not quite what we're talking about. Certain countries will see a surge. In France, for instance, Marine Le Pen's National Rally is expected to come first. That's not that surprising. That party has come first in the last 3 elections. Since 2014, the far-right has been the biggest French party in the European Parliament. However, they are going to really jump. So it was, I believe, a little over 20%, I think 22% in 2019, 23% if I recall. And now together, Rassemblement National and the breakaway far-right party of Marine Le Pen's niece. Some polls I've seen showing them getting 40%. We'll see what happens. But otherwise, in most European countries, we're talking about a pretty modest gain. In the end, the number of seats will be roughly the same. The difference is that the center-right group in the parliament, the European People's Party, is now really open to allying with the far-right. They've done so in a number of governing coalitions across Europe. The leader of the EPP, Manfred Weber, has expressed interest in doing this. So the big question is, once they hit that threshold of above 20%, one-fifth of the parliament, they're going to become kind of serious players mathematically. I think the question is whether they actually become serious players politically, because up till now, they haven't been. They don't really, at least for Marine Le Pen's Identity and Democracy group, they tended to not really show up. So the question is, are they now going to be a force to be reckoned with because they've crossed that threshold?
Very important point you raised there, Dave. But if the right parties become important politically and not just by numbers, how this shift will impact the formation and the functioning of the next European Parliament?
So it's all going to hinge on whether the three centrist parties will between them have a majority. So we're talking about the center-right EPP, the center-left Socialists and Democrats, and the liberal Renew Europe group, that's Emmanuel Macron plus liberals across Europe. Traditionally, since the European Parliament started having direct elections in 1979, the centrist groups have always been able to form a majority, either with just those two main center-left and center-right groups, or sometimes with the addition of the liberals. Now, polls are showing that they should be able to get that majority position. But that's the big question. I mean, polls for the European Parliament are known as not being so reliable, and also they are relying...
And not only.
Not only the European Parliament, exactly. But they are also... It's a bit strange because they're based on the current group formation. But what's going to happen after Sunday is there's going to be a big musical chairs of parties within the political group. So these are all of the national parties. They group together based on their ideology. So all the center-right parties get together in the EPP, the center-left parties get together in the SND. And if some of those parties split, they're particularly thinking about Renew Europe. There is a lot of controversy in that group because Dutch former Prime Minister Mark Rutte's party, VVD, has aligned with the far-right PVV in a coalition government, and some in that group say they should be kicked out. We could see that get them below that threshold. So if that happens, then it might be necessary for the EPP to turn right and to think about forming a governing coalition or a majority coalition with the two far-right groups, the ECR and ID. And if that happens, that would be a pretty big deal. It would impact who they could appoint as European Commission president. Ursula von der Leyen is probably too centrist to be confirmed by a right-wing majority in the parliament. But then also it would impact how the parliament sets its rules, who they select as their president, the speaker, and also votes in the next term.
You mentioned Ursula von der Leyen. She is leading the polls for a second term as president of European Commission. What challenges she may face if the right-wing parties are expected to be more influential?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend. I would say it's the most likely scenario that Ursula von der Leyen will get a second term. It's really nothing to do with the election. I know the parliament likes to pretend this, but this is up to the council. She is liked by the EU leaders. She's pretty malleable. So no one has expressed a strong objection to her. She's definitely courted Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. But there have been rumors that Macron would maybe like to mix things up a little. He's been throwing out the name of Mario Draghi, the former Italian Prime Minister and European Central Bank president. So what she has to worry about really is not so much about the election, it's more about the council. However, in that still unlikely but possible scenario that there is a right-wing majority, then she should be worried, because I don't think she can get confirmed by that right-wing majority. So the council appoints the president, but that president still has to be confirmed by the parliament. And if that centrist majority isn't there, she might be in trouble.
So what's the first task that the new European Parliament will have? Voting the new president of the Commission?
First, they have to form groups. So the first time that the new European Parliament will meet will be in mid-July, the week of the 18th of July. And the very first thing they have to do when they're meeting in Strasbourg is define their group. So by then, but that'll give them about a month of negotiations about which party is going to be in which group. And then that determines the makeup of the parliament. And then we'll see what the majority is. So assuming that the polls are correct and another centrist majority will be formed, then they move ahead with the vote for Commission President. So that nomination or appointment is going to happen at the end of June, June 28th. The EU national leaders will meet here in Brussels, make their selection, then it goes to the Parliament. I've heard that the Parliament wants to vote on this in July, actually, at that session. That wasn't the original plan. They were supposed to vote in September. So I'm a little unclear. I think that might be a little ambitious, but it did happen in July last time in 2019, but that's because there were two sessions. But yes, that will be the big decision that they'll have to make once they form their group. So the first big thing they have to do is decide who their teammates
form the
are,
groups.
And then they have to decide on the president.
And probably they may want to know the new president of the Commission before summer holidays. But let's see the results of the elections first. And depending on the elections, if we're going to see a slight rise or a surge of the right-wing parties, how do you think they will impact the future of the EU's policy-making agenda if they are more relevant in the European Parliament in terms of especially issues on defense, Ukraine, support for Ukraine, economic competitiveness, etc.?
Yeah, so this is the really interesting shift that's happened. So for many years, a lot of these far-right parties wanted their countries to leave the European Union. Then Brexit happened. They saw the effects of Brexit on the UK. Now there is no party in Europe calling for their country to leave the European Union. So the strategy of the far-right has now shifted. Now they want to be more influential within the EU, to bend it to its will, to shape it. Generally, what they want is to make the EU less powerful. So they want more competence brought back to national governments. They want the EU to do less. And they have identified kind of working with the system in order to achieve that. That being said, there are some that can be taken more seriously about this than others. The record of Marine Le Pen's French MEPs and the ID group as a whole is basically a joke, that they're just kind of there when they do deign to show up. Giorgia Meloni's European Conservatives and Reformists is different. They've been more actively involved in shaping legislation. Meloni in particular has been very skilled about making allies in the center-right. The origins of the ECR do come partially from the center-right. It was co-founded by the British Conservatives, along with the right-wing Polish National and Justice Party in 2009. It's drifted way to the right since then. Now it contains some of Europe's most notorious far-right parties like Vox and the Sweden Democrats. However, its origins come as a breakaway party from the EPP, actually. And so that gives it a little more credence. What we're going to see going forward, no matter what the majority is in the parliament, is I think far-right MEPs actually showing up and trying to make a difference on legislation by necessarily teaming up with the center-right EPP, vote by vote.
And you see their influence mostly interested on foreign policy or on internal issues like EU single market and economic policies.
Yeah.
How do you put that?
I think it'll be mostly domestic issues for sure. And I think the big thrust will be blocking EU legislation. So they're going to want to, anything that might take any power away from national governments, they will want to block. And they will also want to pass legislation that would bring power back to national capitals. In terms of foreign policy, there is a split there within these right-wing groups, because the ECR is pro-Ukraine, virulently anti-Russia when it comes to the Polish Law and Justice Party, whereas ID has, those parties have in the past been very friendly with Vladimir Putin. They've taken money from Russia in the past. These days, they're not very vocal about support for Russia, but we all know that that's kind of lingering under the surface, and certainly the ECR knows that. So I think on foreign policy, the best strategy, if they do want to work together, these two groups, and there has been, Marine Le Pen has openly approached Georgia Meloni about merging the ECR and ID. Russia is maybe the one issue that can get in the way there. However, the European Parliament doesn't really have much say over EU foreign affairs, so it's not even really a relevant issue for the Parliament. I don't see that. A lot of people think, it's impossible for those two far-right groups to link up because of the Russia issue. I don't see the problem because the European Parliament has absolutely no power when it comes to foreign policy. And so why should an irrelevant issue that they disagree on get in the way of them cooperating?
Looking ahead, what long-term implications do you foresee, Dave, from these elections for the political landscape of the European Union?
I think that I see this election getting more media attention than I've ever seen in my 15 years here in Brussels. And so I'm expecting a higher turnout than normal. It's very hard to gauge this at this point. There have been some surveys showing like really record high, over 60%. I've even seen 65. But I went back to 2019 and people's voting intentions, they also said that in 2019 and they didn't show up. It was the normal 50%. So I don't know. I suspect though that this time we are actually going to see an increased turnout, and that will reflect that these European issues, particularly over the past 5 years, have really come to the fore. I think because of Brexit, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and because of COVID, those issues were all really Europeanized, those crises. And so I think this election will show that people are paying attention to the European Union more than they ever have before. And sometimes that might be a negative way, and sometimes it might be a positive way. But also certainly, I think that, again, we're not anticipating a big increase of seats in general for the far right. However, all of these overtures that have been made by President von der Leyen, by Manfred Weber, by the EPP during the course of this campaign certainly shows us where this trend is going, that the center-right is going to keep looking to ally with the far right at national level and at European level. And we're getting fewer and fewer voices within the center-right protesting about the direction that they're going in.
So, Dave, this is definitely one of the world's largest democratic exercises after India, I was looking at. And the 720 members will be elected. But how important really is the European Parliament on the EU decision-making?
So it's important, but it's not as important as the European Council. So it is out of the three institutions, you've got the European Commission, which is the executive branch, and then you've got a kind of bicameral legislature, with the European Parliament being the lower house and the European Council, the Council of the EU, being the upper house. What we're electing in this election is just that lower house, and it is the least powerful of those three institutions. The upper house, the Council, functions almost exactly like the Bundesrat in Germany, because it's the representation of the state governments. So each member state of the EU has basically a seat in the Council that's made up of ministers from those home governments. And so the Council political makeup is determined by the national elections that happen whenever they happen. Like the Bundesrat, or actually kind of like the Senate in the US, when the senator elections don't time up exactly with every election every 2 years. So the European Parliament is involved in legislating. No law will pass in the EU without the European Parliament's say so. It is a full-blown legislature. A lot of people like to dismiss it as a talking shop. That's nonsense. It is a real legislature that is very important. However, it's not as important as, let's say, your typical national parliament, in that, like I said, it doesn't really have a say over foreign policy. It can be often overruled by the European Council. The European Council has kind of more heft to it than the Parliament. And the big thing, it can't initiate legislation. So the legislation is actually initiated by the European Commission, and then the Parliament can change it dramatically if they want. They can reject it, they can approve it, but they don't originate legislation. So it's important, but it's not the most important institution in the EU. That is still really the European Commission and then the European Council.
Dave Keating, thank you very much for talking to Atlantic Debrief.
Thanks for having me.